Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Act 4 Rebirth and Reprise by the band The Deer Hunter.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So just to clarify things, I did not misspell anything. The name of the band is The Deer Hunter. The deer as in the dearest of hunters. Yes, The Deer Hunter, and today's album is of course called Act 4 Rebirth and Reprise, and here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
My feet up in the air. Oh. What will happen to us? Do you think we'll make the cut? Or should we give it a try? Give an eye for an eye.
So welcome everyone to today's review about The Deer Hunter's Act 4 Rebirth and Reprise. Today's album is a crossover prog album, which is something that we haven't had on the list in a long while now, and honestly I am pretty happy for it because I do quite enjoy the sound of crossover prog whenever it does cross over the list, and I do like the way that most of the times it kind of just tiptoes between usual mainstream pop rock and progressive rock as well. But firstly, let's recap the history of The Deer Hunter. So our story starts in 2004 with a man called Casey Crescenzo. Casey is a guitarist, a pianist, but even and most of all, he is a very good vocalist. He would start off his musical career in high school being a part of bands such as Anomaly and Disillusion, both of them being very unknown bands, so don't even go ahead and try and look them up. But the real major breakthrough he had was when he moved to Boston and he was approached by a band called The Receiving Ends of Sirens, which wanted him to come and perform with them. But quickly enough, the band discovered that Crescenzo was not only a great vocalist, but a very loving poetic writer. So they actually got him to write a lot of the lyrics on their EP, which happened to be a great amount of leeway, seeing as he wasn't technically even an official member of the band at that point. But not long afterwards, Crescenzo would become an official member of that band, and in 2005 The Receiving End of Sirens would actually sign a publishing contract with the Triple Crown record label, and from that point onwards the band would start producing their own full albums, and in that time Crescenzo would work separately on writing demos, which he would call the misleading demos, which is actually not misleading, it's just misleading. And the sound of the demos, while being good, was not the sound that the band pursued at the time, so they instead didn't go in his direction. But in order to fully express himself, Crescenzo would actually go ahead and form his own band, which would be called The Deer Hunter. And in 2006 The Receiving End of Sirens told Crescenzo pretty respectively to leave the band, so he decided to turn The Deer Hunter into his main project. But luckily for him, the new project would actually be signed by the Triple Crown record label, so he already had a publisher. And Crescenzo would start pretty small, with his debut containing only one other band member being his brother Nick on the drums, as well as several other outside members, as well as his own mother doing doing some backing vocals. And the first album by the Deer Hunter would actually be called Act 1, The Lake South, The River North, which would symbolize a start for something bigger, which was actually a 6th album plan that Crescenzo had planned to make in the future. Now, right from the start, Crescenzo actually had his entire story already mapped out, but in order to make more albums and to actually tell the entirety of the story, he firstly had to be successful. And as it happened, the first album by the Deer Hunter actually turned out to be pretty well received with the average listener. So a year afterwards, he came out with the second act called The Meaning of and All Things Regarding Mrs. Leading. And this second act story, which actually didn't even come to an end by this point when I'm making this video in 2022, regards a character, a boy called Only the Deer Hunter. And the story follows him as a boy that was born on the turn of the 20th century, and he experiences surrealist representations of real life events before unfortunately dying in a premature and abrupt death. Now, from that point onwards, the band would pursue making all the rest of the parts of the Deer Hunter sextilogy, I guess that's what you call that, but it would also make plans for other something illogies, like a 9-part series that has to do with the colors of the rainbow as well as the 2 shades. But other than that, the band have released other extra albums which actually don't follow any other linear storytelling and are just kinda standalone albums within themselves. And while part 3 of the Deer Hunter storyline was published in 2009, fans had to wait a long 6 years until they got the 4th part, which is also the one we're reviewing today, called Act 4, Rebirth and Reprise. Now, as a disclaimer, I made no efforts in actually trying to know what the storyline is and trying to recap it to myself and listening to it and reading about it, just none of that. Even the fans of this band don't even get the storyline that well, so I might not even try. And this album was really well received, being considered by many as the highest point by the Deer Hunter up until today. But looking on the prog archives, you can even see something different and much more interesting. All of their albums by the Deer Hunter are highly rated, but none of them surpassed the 4 rating other than the Deer Hunter series albums, which happens to be only the 5 parts that there are. Now, when listening to this album, I was going through somewhat of a whirlpool of emotions, and it's not because this album was very much emotional, but because I felt very oppository feelings about it throughout it. On the one hand, this album was a very unique blend of symphonic and orchestral blendings with pop rock music with all the classical progressive tropes put into them. But on the other hand, this album kind of went haywire in certain points and sounded much like what I would expect to find on a Disney Channel TV show theme. You see, my highest points within this album were actually solid 9s, like the opener track of Rebirth or the beautiful harmonics filled and very orchestral piece of Remembered. And of course, my personal favorite from the entire album, which happens to be Is There Anybody There, which might not be the peak of this album, but to me just managed to encapsulate everything that's great about this one, and thus I think that I like it more than the rest. But then in quite a stark contrast, you have tracks like The Squeaky Wheel, which, as I said in the description before, not really good, very contemporary, and overall very much a lackluster piece, as well as, let's say, the 4 last tracks on the entire album, which actually might not be as bad as I perceived them to be, but rather just me growing tired of listening to this album by the end of it. Yes, what can I do? I listen to albums usually in one sitting, and towards the end of an album, if it isn't a banker, I usually just kind of get bored with it, and this was probably the case here. Now, I don't say this too often, but personally, I do believe that vinyl records have done a lot of good for the overall quality of music, and one of those things happened to be the runtime of albums. To me, 45 minutes is the perfect time you can have an album run for. More than that, less than that, you know, you can play with it up, but honestly, the 45-minute threshold is the one that I enjoy the most because I find as if my retention is just retained through its entirety. And well, today's album is just kind of a classic case of an album that overstayed its welcome. It's not that it has bad music on it, most of it is actually really good, but the thing is, it just is too long for my taste, and maybe I'll come back to it, but not in one sitting. And just for context, for anyone who doesn't know, this album isn't like 3 hours long, it's just an hour and like 15 minutes long, but honestly to me, it kind of felt a bit too long than it had to be. But yeah, overall, this album, it's a really cool album, and personally, I really enjoyed the way that it incorporated both traditional and quite contemporary pop rock themes, as well as just having these beautiful orchestral arrangements on here being led by the brass, string, and even somewhat wind instruments. It sounds so good, and they didn't overuse them, which is always a great virtue. But in an odd sense, this album didn't really coincide with my comfort zone. I do feel that in the past I would listen to something like this and I would have liked it better, but now it kind of exited my comfort zone, seeing as I have exposed myself to a lot of other weird and wacky realms of progressive music, so I can say that I have a slight longing for this one, although I do feel a noticeable distancing from its music as well. But overall, I would recommend this album for being a pretty good album, and as well as just a pretty accessible album for a lot of people to listen to. You see, there's a good reason why this one actually topped at the 39th place in the Billboard 200 in the USA. So upon first look, this album cover seemed really lovely to me. I don't know, it just really looks good. I love the composition, I love the colors, I love the balance, but I didn't quite realize how good it was made until I downloaded the image off of Google and opened it on my big screen, and then I realized all the intricacies that actually happened within it. So for you viewers' sake, I'm actually gonna zoom in the image so you can see it better. So just look at how beautifully those tree barks are drawn. They look so good with a sort of uncanny psychedelic blobs of liquid, as well as the plague doctor's robes having the slightest velvety tone to them, as well as him holding a crucifix in his hand. Honestly, if I didn't know that this cover was made by a human being, I would have suggested that this one was actually made by AI, of course being artificial intelligence, but of course it was made by a human, and that human is called Nikki Barkala. Nevertheless, that got me interested, so I wanted to see what this cover would look like if it would be generated by an AI. So I tried my best and I entered this prompt into the AI machine and tried to see what it would give, and these were some of the results. So yeah, in quite the unsettling manner actually, this album will be receiving the same rating as the last 6 albums. We're still on the same rating, and that's of course a very repetitive rating of 8 out of 10. But can we get 8 out of 8, 8s out of 10s? Well, I don't know. It really depends on tomorrow's episode, which will be Stardust We Are by the Flower Kings. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wanham, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.